They called him Hoss Cartwright, the big-hearted cowboy who could make the world laugh, cry, and believe in good men again. But behind that famous grin was someone the cameras never saw. A man quietly breaking under the weight of his own success. Because while millions saw him as America's favorite ranch hand, his own family often saw him walking through the front door exhausted, distant, and torn between two worlds. This is the story of Dan Blocker, the gentle giant who gave everything to his craft, and in the process paid a price few ever knew. By the mid-1960s, Bonanza was one of the biggest shows in America. Millions tuned in every week to watch Hoss, Little Joe, and Ben Cartwright bring justice to the frontier. But success came with a cost. Long filming days, endless press, scripts piling up. And through it all, a man who was always smiling, even when he was exhausted. Dirk later admitted that, as a kid, he didn't really understand why his father seemed so tired. He just thought that's how grown-ups worked. But years later, he realized the truth. That fame can feel like a cage, even when it's made of gold. Some reports suggest Dan secretly struggled with the idea of being known more for Hoss than for himself, that he worried people were forgetting the man behind the cowboy hat. It wasn't resentment, it was identity, and that quiet conflict followed him home every night. Off camera, Dan Blocker was nothing like the character he played. He wasn't loud, he wasn't goofy, he was thoughtful, reserved, and incredibly kind. A gentle soul trapped in a giant's body. He loved books, philosophy, and good conversation. He avoided Hollywood parties and glittering premieres, preferring backyard barbecues and quiet evenings in the San Fernando Valley. His agents begged him to move to Beverly Hills. The schools are better, they told him. The neighbors are influential, but Dan didn't care about that. If the schools are good enough for regular kid, he said, they're good enough for mine. That humility made him loved, but it also made him a target of the industry's pressures. Some castmates whispered that Dan was too soft for Hollywood, too genuine, too caring. And they might have been right, because kindness in that world doesn't always protect you. Sometimes it wears you down. Dan met the love of his life, Dolphia Parker, back in college at Sul Rossi State University. They built a family together, 4 kids, 2 boys and 2 girls, and moved into a quiet home in the valley. He wanted his children to have a normal life, even as his own became anything but. They had bedtime rules, what he called the 8 o'clock club. If you weren't asleep by 8, you were out for a week. It sounds funny, but for Dan, it was about structure and love. Still, the outside world always found its way in. Fans showed up at the house, photographers lingered nearby, and even at home, the shadow of Bonanza loomed large. Some say Dan would occasionally tweak his lines or push for scenes that portrayed Hoss as morally upright, not just for the audience, but for his kids. He wanted them to see a man who stood for kindness, not chaos. He could have moved closer to the spotlight, but instead he built a fortress of simplicity, and still fame kept battering at the door. As Bonanza went into its later seasons, the strain on Dan began to show. He gained weight. His face, once bright and lively, often looked tired, but he kept going. The studio needed him. The cast relied on him. And his family. Well, they just hoped he'd get some rest. Friends said he never complained. He just powered through, determined to keep the show running. But rumors suggest there were early warning signs, that Dan had been advised to slow down, to get checked out. He ignored them. Not out of pride, but responsibility. He'd been through worse after all. He'd survived war. How could a little exhaustion stop him now? Long before Hollywood, Dan was a soldier. He served in the Korean War. Not as an entertainer, but as a frontline infantry sergeant. He saw combat. He got wounded. He earned a Purple Heart and a list of medals that spoke of courage most actors could only pretend to have. Those who knew him said the discipline he learned in war never left him. He treated everyone with respect, from co-stars to stagehands. He never barked orders or threw tantrums. But war also changes you. It teaches you to hide pain. And maybe that's what he did. Carry it quietly, smile through it, and keep marching. Because when you've survived the battlefield, you start to believe you can survive anything, until life proves otherwise. In 1972, Dan went in for what should have been a routine gallbladder surgery. His family expected him home in a few days, but fate had other plans. A blood clot formed, traveled to his lungs, and took his life suddenly. He was just 43. Hollywood went silent. The Bonanza set, usually buzzing with laughter, turned somber overnight. Michael Landon, his close friend, said he could cry on cue just by thinking about Dan. That's how deep the bond ran. Fans were heartbroken, writers were lost, and for the first time in television history, a show had to face a reality no one expected: the death of one of its stars. They wrote Hoss's death into the script, though the details were never shown. Later, a spin-off revealed that Hoss died saving another man's life, the perfect ending for a hero who lived exactly that way. Still, whispers lingered. Some fans claimed doctors had noticed early risks, but downplayed them. Others believed studio pressure kept him working longer than he should have. Nothing was proven, but the questions never really went away. Dirk Blocker was just 14 when he lost his father. Too young to understand it, old enough to never forget it. He grew up quietly, carving his own path in Hollywood, guest roles, small parts, then eventually a breakout in Brooklyn Nine-Nine. But for decades, Dirk rarely spoke publicly about his dad, until recently. In interviews, he started opening up about the bedtime routines, the laughter, and the lessons that still guide him today. He says his father taught him that kindness is strength, that a man's worth isn't measured by fame, but by how he treats people when no one's watching. And through his book, Master and the Little Monk, Dirk channeled that same gentleness, a quiet tribute to the father who taught him how to live. For him, it's not about rewriting his father's legacy. It's about revealing the parts the world never saw. The man who didn't need cameras to be great. Even today, Dan Blocker's presence lingers everywhere. There's a Dan Blocker beach on the Malibu coast, a Dan Blocker room in his Texas hometown museum, and a stretch of highway in Nevada that bears his name. Fans still talk about Hoss, how his laugh could fill a room, how his character made Sunday nights feel a little warmer. But to those who knew him, Dan was more than that. He was a husband who came home no matter how late the shoot went, a father who built swimming pools and bedtime clubs just to make his kids smile, and a man who lived by the simplest creed: do good while you can. Legends fade, fame changes, but kindness, the kind Dan carried in every handshake, every scene, every smile, doesn't. In the end, Dan Blocker didn't chase Hollywood. He simply lived his truth, and the world followed. He wasn't perfect. He wasn't invincible, but he was real, and that's what made him unforgettable. When Dirk looks back today, he doesn't see a cowboy or a celebrity. He sees a father, a man who tried, who stumbled, who cared. And maybe that's the part that never died, because long after the camera stopped rolling, Dan Blocker's story still makes people believe in decency, in love, and in the kind of strength that doesn't need to shout. He didn't just play a good man, he was one. And that's why even now, decades later, the world still feels a little safer when we remember Hoss Cartwright, or as his family calls him, Dan.